particularly in terms of the idea of the imagination, the cinematic imagination, to make a story happen with very limited, means physically, and to create this kind of unbelievable scope, to create the believable world that we're actually in the Himalayas in this film. That takes us to 11:30. Let's take for a little break.
Oh yeah. Oh.
The work of Christ, and there is a rivalry between two nuns. One who is the protagonist, who is of course the good girl and stays as a nun and is there to defend the mission of God, and the other, whose face you see on the screen right now, is the kind of secular nun who gets tempted by the ways of the world and discovers that there is perhaps another way to live other than being a nun. And this is a struggle. This is a climactic struggle between these two characters.
And many of the compositing techniques, the ability to take one piece of film and add a new background to it, didn't work so well in color. There was a man named Larry Butler who developed the blue screen technique. This is the blue screen shot that Larry did with the flying carpet. And of course, if you look very closely, you can see a little bit of a blue edge. It was a technique that hadn't been perfected yet, but it is the example that says here is the first time that blue screen compositing was done for a motion picture. I also have some of the mats that were used for this. The idea is basically a stencil where you have a mask that protects one piece of film so that you take what you want from it and place it on another piece of film. And once you're able to do that, there aren't these limitations that you used to have as far as not being able to move the camera. It's a technique that was enormously important. Its development really allowed the modern visual effects picture to be made. A film like Star Wars would use essentially the same technique that was developed for Thief of Baghdad.
Doing visual effects in color is at least 3 times more difficult than black and white, because there's 3 primary colors, right? So in the Fairbanks version, or in any black and white movie, if you're trying to combine separate scenes together, and you've got the perspectives right, the lighting's right, and all that, all you really have to do is get the tones to match. The whites kind of have to match the white, the blacks kind of have to match the black. If you get those matching, it can look pretty darn good. You get the color now, and you've got thousands of colors, and they all have to match up. And that is just incredibly difficult to do, because it can be something the blue can be a little too strong, whereas the red next to it is a little too orange. What do? For these guys in 38 and 39 to tackle a color movie with all these effects of various techniques, and when you get into blue screen, having to extract the colors and put them back together again and still have it look like the same color it should be in the background was very, very difficult. And in fact, the Technicolor people didn't think it was going to work and tried to stop Larry Butler from doing it. Tom Howard just said, nope, when you get kicked off this film, if you proceed this, because it's not going to work. They were so afraid it was going to make color look bad in their minds. And it didn't at all, of course, and it opened a whole new genre of filmmaking that they could do, and a technique that was blue screen.
I think The Flying Horse was a very impressive sequence to me, as well as the appearance of the genie. It all was something out of the storybook. I remember in my early days, when I was very young, as a child, my mother got me a set of wonder books, and it had these wonderful illustrations of various fantasy subjects, people going to the moon in rocket ships, and various other things of a fantasy nature. And those stuck in my mind for years. And here I saw this on the screen. Nothing like it had been done at that period that was as impressive as The Thief of Baghdad.
I actually met Larry Butler, and he told me that they had built a ramp that was blue, that had an angle on it, and they trained a special force to run along the edge of this ramp. And of course, where the blue was, chemically they made the blue go away so that they could put a new background behind it. And if you look at it today, it is crude. You can see that there are transition problems, there's matte lines, there's some technical problems with it. But it was a technique that would be developed and enhanced to the point of being the most effective special effects technique that we use in film.
A lot of people complained about the early blue backing process in the African Queen.
So, just wanted to show you this, I think, to give you a sense of sort of the formal use of it. I also find it interesting, again, just to make the point of how, at the service of what these fantastical narratives were about, you find in the 30s and 40s a kind of move towards a kind of an escapist fantasy, often embedded with a kind of colonialist rhetoric attached. Before we take a break, I want to show you one last example, which is a scene from the Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger film called Black Narcissus. Powell and Pressburger are probably best known for the film called The Red Shoes.
Oh, I just watched that.
It's incredible.
It's on Netflix Instant right now.
Yeah, it's an incredible, Technicolor Fantasia, like an incredible dance. It's a deranged, insane movie. So it's so interesting to look at Powell and Pressburger as sort of less known in their work. There's a film, if you're interested in the sort of history of the notion of sexual representation and kind of fetishization and sexual representation, they made a film called Peeping Tom in the late 1960s that more or less destroyed Powell and Pressburger's career, which was a film that was meant to be a critique of male violence, but isn't really ambiguous film. It's about a cameraman who's a serial killer and films his murders. It's sort of well ahead of its time. It's a movie that, by today's standards, would be, like a contemporary movie, basically. It would be starring Nicolas Cage, and at the time, it was so shocking from a moral perspective, a moral point of view.
What was the name
It's
of
called
that?
That film is called Peeping Tom. It's released. It's a final film of theirs. It's released on the Criterion Collection. It's easily locatable.
What's the director's name, please?
Powell and Pressburger. Powell is Powell, and Pressburger is Pressberger. Interestingly, Michael Powell was married in his later life to Thelma Schoonmaker. Thelma Schoonmaker is probably most famous for being Martin Scorsese's editor. So there's a sort of interesting connection between those two camps of work. I'm going to just show you a little bit from this film. This is really remarkable.
Challenges technically for some new techniques.
Parent traps, two girls.
Parent trap. Yeah, right. Now, what I find really interesting is that the narratives, it's like there's a progression of the kind of narratives of the doubling of the identity. In the post-World War II, you have, it relates to socioeconomic reasons. One of the things you can read in film noir, for instance, is the changing dynamic between men and women after World War II. Men go away to fight in war, women are left home, at least in America, left home, many of them taking jobs in factories and having jobs for the first time in a generation that they'd ever had that were usually male-held jobs. And so when men returned from the war, there was a kind of, they were emasculated and freaked out by the fact that their wives were working in a factory or were executives, and it's completely in the representation of World War II, post-World War II film noir. You have these predatory, powerful female characters practically consuming these weak, dependent male characters. Or you have these fractured female characters where their identities are shattered into two. One is the good girl and the other is the hellion. And I think those representational things are kind of, just like I was talking yesterday, how I think horror films give you a way to sort of express sort of hidden or suppressed things within the culture, or metaphorical or allegorical things within the culture. These fantastical narratives express some of the cultural anxieties of that period of time.
What about Dr. Strangelove?
What do you want to say about it?
And the doubling of Peter Sellers.
No, amazing, and I think that, and they are being used for a kind of, then by that time move forward to be used for a kind of social and political critique of, the war machine in a way that's really compelling. I find it interesting how special effects comes out of the kind of relatively naive narratives like in Georges Méliès that are fantastical and imaginary, although also kind of socially rooted. You could see The Devilish Tenant as a story of sort of, the eternal struggle between tenant and landlord being written as a kind of comical narrative. And I think that it's interesting that the tradition of special effects has generally been relegated to children's work or kind of other stories. But if you really look at it in a more deep way, it's often, the fantastical or the special effect has often been used as a kind of conduit to express the uncanny, the thing that you cannot represent through any other method.
Do you think that the opposite would have the same effect, like in That Obscure Object of Desire, when he has the female be two different characters? So instead of one actor playing two different characters, it's two actors playing one character.
No, I think that there is a restless kind of experimentation with formal structures to try to pry underneath the meanings of narrative and unlodge something, to find another kind of truth. So Buñuel is using all of these different kind of techniques and tools to try to, attack and unbraid bourgeois ideology. I mean, the inheritor of that kind of tradition we looked at yesterday, I'm Not There, which is the idea of the fracturing and shattering of identity in a kind of quote-unquote postmodern way by having multiple actors play the part. I think what's interesting, I don't want to make a kind of hard polarity in your mind, but I do think that there's an interesting dialogue between expressionism and naturalism in cinema since the earliest days. The idea of, on the one hand, that the camera is there to record and not interpret, and on the other hand, the camera is a device of magic. It's there to interpret and speculate. And that you see this still. I mean, there's at least now we're coming out of a period, but certainly maybe the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a very powerful rejection of expressionist work. And kind of, the Cannes Film Festival, for instance, almost everything that's shown in the Cannes Film Festival could be characterized as so-called neo-realist movie. There's no special effects. There's, everything's shot within a kind of verite documentary, a relatively naturalistic idiom. Again, the Dardenne brothers as an example of sort of a kind of pinnacle of this way of working, a kind of use of non-traditional actors, non-professional actors, and that's descending out of many traditions, including Bresson. And on the other hand, there's a kind of this opposite strand, cinema as a kind of ability to express interiority or to express allegory, to be used to express for metaphoric reasons, not for materialist, factual reasons. Those two poles, I think, are really interesting because the movement back and forth between them often yields kind of odd synthetic hybrids of those kind of, the argument and counter-argument between the different techniques, the different ways of thinking of moving forward. Okay, so this is a little bit from the Thief of Baghdad, just talking about sort of the effects in the movie. Here we are. And I give you tomatoes another day. see it internationally, which is the idea of the formalist, structuralist, abstract strand of working. It's not narratively driven, it doesn't involve actors, it's essentially about the idea of play of rhythm, light, and abstraction. I think the techniques he uses are remarkable. He takes an unexposed piece of 35mm and lays down nails and the rest of it. Some of the imagery is actually photographed in camera, like the naked body and the rest of it in shadows. But the kind of techniques and tools he uses lay the groundwork for later abstract American filmmakers, particularly Stan Brakhage, I'm thinking of. He's one of the pioneers of the 1960s and all the way into the 70s and 80s, about kind of formalist, structuralist filmmaking. You see a kind of number of examples of this, and this is one of, I think, the real tensions that has animated experimental filmmaking, is sort of finding a middle ground between, you know, the sort of normative, dominant representations of Hollywood, of sort of, you know, cause and effect chains of storytelling and narrative, and the idea of more pure painterly or abstract play of you know, light and image. You can also see those same kind of poles in other forms, especially in painting in that same period of time, the early 20th century. You see the move towards abstraction, the rejection of representation, you know, obviously with the introduction of Cubism and Picasso and the rest of it, moving towards abstract expressionism in the 40s and 50s, and then this sort of utter reversal in the late 1950s in America back towards pop art and representation, and sort of a shock of the new that represented. Because instead of just having abstract images, we suddenly had recognizable imagery and content in the work again. I want to show just one more example of this kind of a sort of playful formalist example of working. This is an amateur film made by a cinematographer, very little known. This is, again, from the series I've talked about in this classroom called More Treasures from the American Archive. And this is a short from 1925, so this is 2 years after Man Ray's short, and it's called Cockeyed.
Called what?
Called Cockeyed.
Okay.
This is listed on your thing. It will make me wait. I cannot skip this.
And this is More Treasures from the American Archive.
More Treasures from the American Archive.
Okay.
Yeah, was the other show you put on had a score by Georgian Thiel?
Yes.
Is that original to the...
No. It was posted on the More Treasures Archive. Has been an archive process where they've basically gone back, and like the Zora Neale Hurston stuff is in this same series. It's a really interesting series now. The first series was 3 discs, the second was 4, and there's a third disc that I haven't purchased yet that I think is 4 more discs. It ranges from documentary to experimental to narrative work. All of them pair restorations of the film with recreations or attempts to recreate the audio, the musical work. And there's a kind of really nice piece of scholarship that attaches to it, not only talking about sort of the underlying material, all that stuff about Zora Neale Hurston I didn't know except for reading that text, and the same way about sort of how they constructed the music or where they got it from. Here we go. See immediately the kind of pop vernacular. It's not serious art like Man Ray. It's from a nutty cameraman.
Is that the Strand movie?
Totally. I know.
Yeah, Super Mario Brothers music.
Oh, that's awesome. Oh my god, there's 12 of us in the shop.
So another example of a kind of just very simple formalist experimental film. This is using in-camera double exposure. For those of you who are not technical geeks, basically a piece of film is loaded into the camera. A mat is put in front of the lens, which is a black card, essentially, that stops half of the film from being exposed. The film is exposed all the way through the camera, then rewound, and a mat is put on the other side of the image, and the image shot again. Keep this in mind as I move forward, because I want to make a comparison to the movie Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, actually, which goes back and uses all of these kind of formalist, handmade, in-camera special effects from the early 20th century. And it's one of the things I think is interesting. Again, the idea of revolutionary or work that's supposed to be seen as kind of boundary setting. Eternal Sunshine has been much lauded for its inventiveness, but Eternal Sunshine is backward-looking as much as it's forward-looking. I think much of the innovations have gone in cinema, and this is really my point, is that the language we're working with in cinema is an incredibly elastic language. I don't think you can think, oh, what's happened in the 20s has already been decided, and we can move past it and forget about it. I want to switch now and show a sort of different kind of experimental work, which is in some ways almost inadvertently experimental work, because it was not intended to be a kind of experimental piece of filmmaking, but in fact, by today's standards, it really is. It's I don't know, maybe you'll like it or not. Last year this was the wild hit. People were like, what is this movie? This movie is called Tomato is Another Day.
I like it already.
Tomato is Another Day. Tomato is Another Day is directed by J.S. Watson. It's from 1933. 7 minutes long. This is again from the Unseen Cinema series. And I mean, rather than frame it first, I think I'm going to just show it to you and then I'll talk a little bit about it. Okay, you can kill it.
I don't know that one.
It's super, but I have no idea.
It's like, it's not in the real cool, is it? It's not in
And it's not in the other cinema books.
using the other, it's not that.
And key figures in terms of experimental filmmaking, which is Georges Méliès, who I assume that you are aware of. Georges Méliès was one of the pioneers of cinema. He began he was a contemporary of Lumiere in France in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Georges Méliès made a number, dozens, of short films, short specialty films. His training and background was as a stage magician, and he worked within the techniques of stage mechanics and stage magic that were very highly developed in the late 19th century. One of the things I think is really interesting to look at the early roots of cinema, particularly, is how it's both has one foot straddling the 19th century traditions of the proscenium, the idea of a fixed focal point of view, seeing something from one point of view, and what happens in the 20th century when the ability of a camera to move and divide space in a kind of cubist and fractured way develops. So, if you look at the difference between, for instance, something like Georges Méliès, and you jump forward 100 years later and you look at Lars von Trier's work, you can really see the kind of explosion of space, the kind of cubist space, and the idea of all this original work happening kind of in the early fixed perspective. Probably the most famous of the Méliès shorts is a short called A Trip to the Moon, which I'm not going to show here. I suspect you all have seen it. If you've not seen it, go to YouTube and just type in A Trip to the Moon and watch it. It's a remarkable sort of early, naive science fiction film using models, puppets, all kinds of different special effects to achieve this kind of fantastical journey to the moon. What I'm going to show here is just a short of his called The Devilish Tenant.
Méliès plays the part of a tenant who goes to see the concierge because he's looking for a good apartment. Rent is due. Whitney.
So the first thing I just want to make a point of is the notion of editing as the cut, as the first invention of a special effect. In other words, the way that the magical jumps happen in this is that there is, just like in the television show Bewitched, motion happens, the character would stop, and then the picture would fly and attach to the wall. And so magically something would fly up onto the wall. And this idea of just making a cut, changing the view, what was not possible, the idea of manipulating time and space through the camera became one of the first cinematic special effects. What we now take for granted, the ability of editing, is something that's really changed dramatically in Méliès' work. You can see in this work that it has a fixed view, in other words, a frontal proscenium-based view where we have to see the action from one position only. I think what's interesting, and you can also see, I'll show you just quickly, if I over one of them again, this is also an example of hand-colored, we were talking about hand-tinted material, this is all hand-tinted. You can actually see in this too, the cut, look at the top of the frame, every time one of the cuts happens, there's actually a slice. Entirely unremarkable, but by the late 19th century, early 20th century is quite remarkable, is a different kind of cut. So first there is the special effects cut, where you have a fixed view, you cut and something in the frame changes, and so you have a magical edit that appears. But if you think about how time and space was rendered in the theater, characters, when they were in a scene, had to walk onto the stage and walk off of the stage. There was a literal rendering of time and space. What happens here is one of the first modern cuts, which is a crowded room full of people in the middle of a meal. They're all in the middle of action. Cut. He sits alone. You can turn the light back on. I know that seems like an entirely unremarkable edit, but the grammar of filmmaking, the idea of being able to cut on action and have somebody not exit, so in other words, to set a new scene. In the stage, you had to close the lights or fade the lights, and you had to show someone walk on, sit down, light their pipe. And this idea of a new grammar that allows you to condense time and space is entirely cinematic, is something that we've now taken entirely for granted. I want to make a comparison. I think this idea of, the so-called jump cut, this idea of a fixed view where something changed, was pioneered later in the French New Wave in the late 1950s and early 1960s, particularly if you look at Godard's Breathless. You'll see many, many examples of the so-called jump cut, where a frame remains the same, and then something changes in the frame, and there's a kind of dynamic cut, a jump cut. If you look at something like, again, to use Lars von Trier as an example, or there's also a movie called by Eric Zamka called The Dream Life of Angels, a beautiful film from the mid-1990s. It's an editing style that's entirely articulated on this idea of jump cutting, of telescoping action into small pieces. I want to show, just by comparison with Méliès, the opening of the movie Bonnie and Clyde, which I assume you've all seen before, and show you a little edit in it, which interestingly is kind of the inheritor of this tradition.